Part 1. The Cold Wind on the Frontier. The wind had a bite to it that spoke of a deep and bitter winter to come. It swept down from the snow-dusted peaks of the distant mountains, carrying the scent of pine and ice across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the American West. It was the autumn of 1875, and for Clara Monroe, each gust felt like a personal warning. The land was raw, a canvas of cracked earth and hardy sagebrush painted in shades of brown and gray, stretching toward a horizon that promised nothing but more of the same. In the heart of this desolation lay the town of Dustwood. It was less a town and more a temporary truce with the wilderness, a single muddy street flanked by a dozen rough-hewn wooden buildings, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a church whose steeples seemed to stab at the vast, indifferent sky. This was Clara's destination, the place where the thin letter from a distant cousin she'd never met promised a new beginning. At 19, Clara was a study in fragile resilience, raised within the cloistered, pious walls of the St. Jude's Church orphanage since the age of 5. Her knowledge of the world was gleaned from Scripture and the hushed, cautionary tales of the sisters. She was innocent, not from a lack of intelligence, but from a profound lack of experience. Her heart, pure and untested, held a faith as delicate as a desert flower. She believed in the inherent goodness of people and the unwavering protection of God, concepts that were about to be put to the harshest of tests. Her entire life was packed into a single, worn leather satchel. Inside, nestled between a change of clothes and a small, leather-bound Bible, was a small tin box. It held the sum of her worldly wealth, $12.50, painstakingly saved from years of mending and cleaning at the orphanage. It was a fortune to her, the key that would unlock a small room to rent, a few weeks of food, and the chance to find honest work before the first snows sealed Dustwood off from the world. The stagecoach had left her at a crossroads 5 miles out of town, the driver gruffly pointing down a path that was little more than 2 ruts in the dirt. Dustwood's that way, he'd grunted before cracking his whip and disappearing in a cloud of dust, leaving her utterly alone. The silence was the first thing that struck her. It was a living entity, vast and deep, broken only by the mournful cry of the wind. She clutched her satchel tighter and began to walk, her button-up boots ill-suited for the rugged terrain. With each step, the teachings of the orphanage felt more distant, like a dream fading in the harsh light of day. Here, there were no stone walls to protect her, only the endless sky and the watching mountains. She had been walking for nearly an hour when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A flicker of hope sparked in her chest. Perhaps it was a kind farmer or a traveler who could offer a ride. She turned, a hopeful smile gracing her lips, only to see 2 riders emerging from a rocky outcrop. They were not farmers. Their faces were obscured by trail dust and grizzled beards, and their eyes held a predatory glint that made the blood run cold in her veins. "Well now, look what we got here," the larger of the 2 men sneered, his voice a gravelly rasp. He reined in his horse, blocking her path, a little sparrow, far from the nest. Clara froze, her hand flying to the small wooden cross that hung around her neck. "Good day, sirs. I'm just on my way to Dustwood." The second man, leaner and with a long scar down his cheek, chuckled. "In a hurry. Are we? What's in the bag?" "Little sparrow. Something for us." Before she could react, the larger man dismounted. He moved with a speed that belied his bulk, snatching the satchel from her grasp. Clara cried out, a sound of pure, terrified protest. "Please, sir, that's everything I have." He ignored her plea, tearing the bag open and dumping its contents onto the dusty ground. Her spare dress, the Bible, and the small tin box. The man with the scar dismounted and snatched the box, prying it open with a dirty thumb. His eyes lit up at the sight of the coins and folded bills. "Pay dirt," he cackled, pocketing the money. Tears streamed down Clara's face, hot and furious. "May God forgive you," she whispered. her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and righteous anger. The first man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He picked up her Bible, flipping through its delicate pages with contempt. "God's a long way from here, Missy." He tossed the book into the dirt and mounted his horse. "Best you learn that now." They spurred their horses and galloped away, leaving Clara standing amidst the scattered remnants of her life. She sank to her knees, the sharp stones digging into her skin, and stared at her Bible lying open in the dust. The wind whipped a page back and forth, as if mocking her. Everything, her money, her hope, her fragile belief in a just world was gone. The cold was seeping into her bones now, a deeper chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The sun was beginning to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. But Clara saw none of it. She only saw the encroaching darkness. She didn't know how long she knelt there, shivering and lost. The vibrant sunset faded to a bruised twilight, and the temperature dropped sharply. The wind grew stronger, carrying the first stinging pellets of sleet. A storm was coming, a real one. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through her shock. To stay here was to perish. She gathered her few belongings, her hands clumsy with cold, and stumbled onward toward the faint, distant lights of Dustwood, praying for a deliverance she no longer truly believed would come. Ethan Walker felt the storm in his bones. He'd learned to read the sky and the wind during his years with the cavalry, and he knew this wasn't just an early flurry. This was a blizzard, the kind that could bury a man and his horse in a matter of hours. He urged his stallion, Aries, into a faster canter, his face set in a grim, unreadable mask. He was a man carved from the very land he rode across, tough, weathered, and solitary. Well past 30, Ethan's face was a map of hard-lived years, with lines etched around his eyes from squinting into the sun and a jaw that seemed permanently clenched against the world. He was a wealthy man by the standards of the frontier, his sprawling ranch a testament to a decade of relentless work. But the wealth brought him no joy. His heart was a fallow field, salted by the loss of his wife and infant son to a fever 5 years prior. Love, he had decided, was a fool's gamble, a weakness this land would exploit and destroy. He had buried his heart with them and had no intention of ever digging it up. He was heading back to his ranch after a final check on the northern herd when he saw a small, dark shape stumbling through the rapidly whitening landscape. At first, he thought it was a wounded coyote, but as he drew closer, he saw it was a woman, or rather, a girl. Barely more than that. She was woefully underdressed for the weather, her thin coat offering little protection against the driving snow. He reined Aries to a halt a few feet from her. She looked up, her face pale and streaked with tears, her eyes wide with a fear so profound it momentarily startled him. She was on the verge of collapse. "You'll die out here," he stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It wasn't a question or an offer of help. It was a simple fact. Clara stared up at the formidable figure on the massive black horse. He looked like an avenging angel cast in shadow, his broad shoulders covered by a heavy oilskin duster, the brim of his hat low over his eyes. Fear, sharp and primal, lanced through her. She was in no condition to face another threat. "Please," she stammered, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. I was robbed. I'm trying to get to Dustwood." Ethan's gaze was sharp, missing nothing the lack of a proper winter cloak, the cheap boots, the terror in her eyes. He'd seen predators of all kinds, and he recognized their mark on her. He felt a flicker of something, a ghost of the protective instinct he thought long dead. It annoyed him. He swung himself down from the saddle. "Dustwood's another 2 miles. You won't make it." He didn't wait for her to argue. With an economy of movement, he lifted her as if she weighed nothing and set her on the front of his saddle. She let out a small gasp, too weak and cold to resist. He mounted behind her, his large frame a solid wall against the wind. Her small body was trembling violently against his chest. "My ranch is closer," he said, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "You can shelter there till the storm passes." He wrapped one arm around her waist to hold her steady and turned Aries toward home. Clara leaned into his strength, her consciousness fading. The smell of leather, snow, and something uniquely male filled her senses. She was terrified of this harsh, silent man. Yet in the circle of his arm, she felt the first flicker of warmth and safety she had known all day. It was a confusing, unsettling paradox. As the blizzard closed in around them, a white curtain erasing the world, she finally succumbed to the cold and the exhaustion, slumping against him as darkness claimed her. Clara awoke to the crackle of a fire and the scent of strong coffee. For a moment, she was disoriented, her mind struggling to piece together the nightmare of the previous day. She was lying on a soft bed, softer than any she had ever known, covered by a thick quilt made of heavy wool. She sat up slowly, a wave of dizziness washing over her. She was in the main room of a large, rustic cabin. It was a man's space, stark and functional, yet built with an unmistakable quality. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows across the polished wooden floor. A long dining table and chairs sat in the center of the room, and shelves filled with books lined another wall, a surprising sight on the frontier. Everything was impeccably clean, orderly, and empty. The silence in the cabin was as profound as the silence of the plains. A figure moved in the corner of her eye, and she started. The man from the storm was sitting in a leather armchair by the fire, a steaming mug in his hands, watching her. His expression was as unreadable as it had been in the snow. "You're awake," he said. It wasn't a warm welcome. Where am I?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The Walker Ranch. Drink this." He rose and walked over to the stove, pouring a cup of coffee and bringing it to her. His movements were deliberate and graceful. When he handed her the mug, their fingers brushed. A jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. Clara quickly pulled her hand back, her cheeks flushing. She took a sip of the coffee. It was black and bitter, but its heat spread through her, chasing away the last of the deep, gnawing cold. "Thank you, Mr.
Walker. Ethan Walker.
I'm Clara Monroe. I am deeply grateful for your help, Mr.
Walker, you saved my life."
He gave a slight, dismissive nod and returned to his chair. "The storm will last another day, maybe two. Once the path is clear, I'll take you into Dustwood." The mention of Dustwood brought the reality of her situation crashing back down on her. She had no money, no connections, and nowhere to go. The cousin in the letter might as well be on the moon. Despair threatened to swallow her whole. Tears welled in her eyes, and she fought to hold them back, unwilling to show more weakness in front of this intimidating man. Ethan watched her struggle, his face impassive. He had seen her small satchel, noted its meager contents. He knew what it meant to be left with nothing on the frontier. It was a death sentence, just a slower one than freezing in a blizzard. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the pop and hiss of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. Clara stared into her cup, her mind racing. What would she do? She could not accept charity. The sisters had taught her that. Pride was a virtue, but pride would not fill her stomach or put a roof over her head. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his voice cutting through the quiet. "I need a housekeeper." Clara looked up, startled. A what?" "This is a large house for one person," he said, gesturing vaguely at the room. "My last housekeeper. A widow from town. Got married and moved east last month. I need someone to cook, clean, manage the supplies. It's honest work. I pay a fair wage." He was looking at her intently now, his gaze so direct it felt as though he could see right through her, laying bare all her fears and desperation. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. A job. It was a lifeline, an answer to a prayer she had been too broken to even utter, but the implication sent a tremor of unease through her. To live here, alone, with this man. Her mind immediately filled with the stern warnings from the orphanage about propriety, about a woman's reputation being her most precious possession. To live unchaperoned in the home of an unmarried man, no matter how wealthy or respectable, was social suicide. The whispers, the gossip, the condemnation. She could already hear them. In a small town like Dustwood, they would call her his mistress, his kept woman. She would be branded, an outcast. Ethan saw the conflict warring in her eyes. It would be a simple arrangement, he clarified. His tone clipped, as if sensing her hesitation and finding it illogical. A business transaction. You need shelter and work. I need a housekeeper. You would have your own room, or your duties would be clear. He was offering her survival. A warm bed, food in her belly, a purpose. The alternative was to walk into Dustwood with nothing but the clothes on her back and a Bible, facing starvation or, worse, the kind of life that truly did ruin a woman. Her honor, the very thing she was afraid of losing, would be the first thing she'd be forced to sell. The choice was brutal in its simplicity, a life of shame and whispers, or a slow, virtuous death. She looked at Ethan Walker, at his hard face and the deep-seated loneliness in his eyes that he tried so hard to conceal. He was a mystery, a man who seemed both dangerous and strangely honorable. He had rescued her without a second thought, but now offered help as if it were a ledger to be balanced. She was frightened of him, but she was more frightened of the world outside this cabin's walls. Clara took a deep breath, the scent of wood smoke filling her lungs. She thought of the men on the road, of the cold, of the utter desolation of being alone. Her faith told her to trust in Providence, but the reality of her situation told her that Providence had just offered her a deal. She met his gaze. Her own chin held a little higher. For the first time since the robbery, a flicker of her inner strength returned. She would not be a victim. She would survive. I accept your offer, Mr. Walker, she said, her voice clear and steady, a stark contrast to the storm raging both outside and within her own heart. I will be your housekeeper. Part 2. The Flame in the Cabin. The days following the storm settled into a quiet, demanding rhythm, governed by the rising sun and the needs of the ranch. For Clara, the Walker cabin became her entire world, a sanctuary of warmth and labor sealed off by a landscape of brilliant, blinding snow. The life was harder than any she had known, yet it was also more real. The abstract virtues of the orphanage patience, diligence, humility were here given tangible form. Patience was a pot of beans simmering for hours on the stove. Diligence was scrubbing Ethan's work clothes on a washboard until her knuckles were raw. Humility was the humbling realization of how little she truly knew about survival. Her first attempts at cooking were near disasters. The bread didn't rise, the bacon burned, and the coffee was a watery, bitter brew. Yet Ethan never complained. He ate what she put in front of him with a stoic silence, his expression unchanging. His lack of criticism was, in its own way, more unnerving than a reprimand would have been. It made her determined to do better, to earn her keep not just through effort, but through competence. She began to study the well-worn cookbook left by the previous housekeeper, her brow furrowed in concentration as she deciphered recipes for sourdough starters and hearty beef stews. Slowly, meticulously, she learned. The cabin began to transform under her care. The ever-present film of dust vanished from the bookshelves. The windows, once grimy, now let in the sharp winter light. She mended the small tears in Ethan's shirts, her stitches neat and even, a skill honed by years of practice at St. Jude's. She found a flock of chickens in a coop behind the main house, and soon The simple joy of collecting fresh eggs each morning became a cherished ritual. The work was endless, but it was honest. It filled her days and kept the tendrils of fear and uncertainty at bay. Each evening, when she finally sat down, her body aching with a satisfying weariness, she felt a sense of ownership, of belonging, that she had never felt before. Ethan remained an enigma. He was a man of profound silence, leaving before dawn and often returning after dusk, smelling of horse, leather, and the cold winter air. He moved with a quiet intensity, his presence filling the cabin even when he was in another room. But Clara began to see the cracks in his hardened exterior. She noticed the way his gaze would sometimes linger on the fire, a deep, haunting sadness in his eyes. She saw the gentleness with which he treated his horse, Aries, whispering to the animal in a low, soothing tone she never heard him use with people. He began to teach her things, in his own gruff, indirect way. One afternoon, he found her struggling to split firewood, the axe heavy and awkward in her hands. Without a word, he took it from her, adjusted her grip, and showed her how to use her body's weight to drive the blade, not just the strength of her arms. He never praised her, but when she successfully split a log on her own, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not quite approval, but a quiet acknowledgement. The biggest challenge was learning to ride. He chose a gentle, older mare for her named Daisy. Her first lesson was terrifying. The world looked impossibly high from the saddle, and the sheer power of the animal beneath her was overwhelming. "She can feel you're scared," Ethan said, his voice steady as he held Daisy's bridle. "They know. Just breathe. Let her feel you're in control, even if you're not." It was the most he had said to her at one time, following his instruction. She forced herself to relax, her hands loosening on the reins, and as the days turned into weeks, her fear slowly gave way to exhilaration. To ride across the snow-covered fields, the cold air sharp against her face, was to feel a sense of freedom she had never imagined. It was on these rides that she truly began to understand the vast, beautiful, and dangerous land she now called home. One day, while cleaning the small, spare room at the back of the house that Ethan clearly never used, she found a small, dust-covered wooden chest tucked under the bed. It wasn't locked. Hesitantly, her heart beating a little faster, she lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of folded linen, was a small pair of baby's shoes, a child's worn wooden bird, and a daguerreotype of a smiling young woman with kind eyes, holding a bundled infant. Clara closed the chest quickly, a wave of guilt washing over her for intruding on such a private sorrow. But it was too late. The image was seared into her mind. This was his wife, his child. The coldness she had mistaken for cruelty was not that at all. It was a wall, built brick by brick around a grief so profound it had hollowed him out. That night, when he came in from the cold, she looked at him not with fear, but with a deep, aching compassion that was dangerously close to something else entirely. When the snows finally receded enough to make the trail passable, Ethan announced they were going to Dustwood for supplies. A knot of anxiety tightened in Clara's stomach. The cabin had been her cocoon. Now she had to face the world that lay beyond it. Dustwood was just as she remembered it, a raw, muddy collection of buildings huddled against the vast wilderness. But this time, she was not an anonymous traveler. She was arriving in the wagon of the town's most prosperous and reclusive rancher. As Ethan guided the wagon down the main street, she felt the eyes on her. Windows twitched with curious onlookers. Men on the boardwalk stopped their conversations to stare. The general store was a cacophony of smells, coffee beans, cured meats, tobacco, and dry goods. As Ethan began to methodically tick off items from a list, Clara felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find a stout woman with a face like a sour apple, her hair pulled into a severe bun. It was Abigail Hayes, a wealthy widow whose ranch bordered Ethan's and whose ambitions, it was rumored, had long included becoming the next Mrs. Walker. "Well, well, Mrs.," Hayes said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as her eyes raked over Clara's simple, mended dress. "So you're the new— Help!" The word was loaded with insinuation. Before Clara could find her voice, two other women drifted over, drawn like moths to a flame. "We were all so worried about poor Mr. Walker, all alone out there," one of them chirped. "It's a blessing he found someone to warm his home." The meaning was unmistakable. Clara's face burned with a shame so hot it brought tears to her eyes. She was being judged and condemned by these women who knew nothing of her circumstances, nothing of the terror that had driven her to Ethan's door. She was exactly what she had feared. She would become a scandal, a piece of gossip. The town had already written her story, casting her as the fallen woman, the virgin kept in the rich cowboy's cabin. The whispers followed her as she moved through the store, a toxic cloud of speculation. She saw the way the storekeeper's wife looked at her, a mixture of pity and contempt. Ethan seemed oblivious, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He concluded his business, loaded the wagon, and helped Clara up to the seat without a word. But on the ride back, the comfortable silence that had grown between them was replaced by a tense, brittle one. Clara stared straight ahead, fighting back tears, the cruel words of the townswomen echoing in her head. He finally broke the silence as his ranch came into view. "Don't pay them any mind," he said, his voice low. "Their lives are small. They fill them with talk." It was meant to be a comfort, but it only confirmed that he had heard, that he knew what they were saying. The business arrangement, the clear lines he had drawn between them, had been erased by the town's ugly assumptions. Now, they were bound together in a scandal not of their making. The trip to town changed everything. The innocence of their arrangement was gone, replaced by a charged self-awareness. Clara found herself watching him more, noticing the way the firelight caught the silver strands in his dark hair, the strength in his hands as he repaired a piece of tack. The fear she once felt had completely vanished, replaced by a confusing flutter in her chest whenever he was near. She was drawn to the quiet sadness in him, and a fierce, protective instinct rose in her, a desire to see him smile, just once. For Ethan, Clara's presence had become a quiet constant, a warmth in the cold emptiness of his house. He had hired her for practical reasons, but he had not anticipated the effect her quiet strength and gentle spirit would have on him. He found himself looking forward to coming home at the end of the day, to the smell of fresh bread and the sight of her sitting by the fire, her head bent over a book or a piece of mending. She was a light in the darkness he had inhabited for 5 long years, and it terrified him. He had sworn off love, off the vulnerability that came with it. Yet, he was being pulled toward her by a current stronger than his resolve. One night, a week after their trip to town, the wind howled outside with a renewed ferocity, rattling the window panes. A fresh blanket of snow was falling, isolating them once more. They sat in their usual chairs by the fire, the chessboard between them. He had been teaching her to play, and she was a surprisingly quick study. She had just moved her knight, a clever, unexpected move that put his king in jeopardy. He looked up from the board to study her, and he saw not a girl, but a woman. Her face, illuminated by the soft firelight, was etched with concentration, her brow slightly furrowed. A loose strand of her honey-blonde hair had fallen across her cheek. Without thinking, he reached out, his calloused fingers gently tucking the strand behind her ear. His touch was feather-light, but it sent a shock wave through Clara. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her gaze lifted to meet his, and the air between them grew thick, heavy with everything that had gone unspoken for weeks. The sounds of the cabin, the crackling fire. The howling wind faded into a dull roar in her ears. There was only the intensity of his eyes, dark and searching, filled with a raw emotion she had never seen there before. The loneliness, the grief, the burgeoning tenderness, it was all there. He leaned forward, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. but she couldn't. She was held captive by his gaze, by a longing that had been secretly blooming in her own heart. This moment felt both terrifying and inevitable, like a storm that had been gathering on the horizon and had finally arrived. When his lips met hers, it was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of profound gentleness, of hesitation and discovery. It was tentative, soft, a question asked without words. His lips were chapped from the cold, but warm. He tasted of coffee in the winter night. The rich cowboy kissed her slowly, a deep and soul-stirring tenderness in the simple, deliberate movement. In that moment, he was not just her employer, not just a grieving widower, but a man reaching out from the ruins of his life. For Clara, who had never been kissed, the sensation was overwhelming. A deep, sweet warmth unfurled in the pit of her stomach, spreading through her limbs like liquid fire. It was a feeling so new and powerful, it stole her breath. It was the awakening of a part of herself she never knew existed. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were dark with a turbulent mix of emotions. He looked as stunned as she felt. The spell was broken. The reality of what they had just done rushed in, and with it, the cold, hard judgment of the outside world. Clara's hand flew to her lips, her cheeks flaming scarlet. A war was raging inside her. Every instinct, every newly awakened feminine impulse had gloried in that kiss. But the voice of the orphanage, the whispers of the townswomen, screamed in her mind. Ruined, a fallen woman, no better than you should be. Without a word, she stood up, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. She couldn't look at him. Turning abruptly, she fled to the safety of her small room, closing the door softly behind her. She leaned against it, her heart pounding a wild, frantic rhythm against her ribs. Torn between the most exquisite feeling she had ever known and the most profound fear. The flame had been lit, and she was terrified she would be consumed by it. Part 3. Prejudice and Temptation. The kiss lingered in the air between them, an invisible, charged particle that altered the very atmosphere of the cabin. The easy silence they had once shared was gone, replaced by a dense, awkward quiet. They moved around each other with a new, stilted formality, their eyes refusing to meet. Clara's days were still filled with the same chores, but her mind was a constant whirlwind. She would find her hands stilling over the dishpan, her thoughts drifting back to the brief, warm pressure of his lips, the gentle surprise of his touch. The memory sent a shiver of both delight and shame through her. Ethan, for his part, retreated even further behind his wall of stoicism. He became more remote than ever, his words clipped, his presence fleeting. He took to spending longer days out on the range, checking fence lines that didn't need checking, pushing himself and his horse to the point of exhaustion. He was running from the ghost of a kiss, from a feeling he had sworn he would never allow himself to feel again. By trying to protect them from the complication of what had happened, he was creating a chasm between them that felt colder and more desolate than the winter landscape outside. This fragile, tense truce was shattered by the necessities of life. They were running low on salt, flour, and coffee, and another trip to Dustwood was unavoidable. The dread that settled in Clara's stomach was a cold, heavy stone. She would have to face the whispers and the cold stares again. She would have to face Abigail Hayes. What she did not anticipate was that she would also have to face Sheriff Morgan. Sheriff Jedediah Morgan was a man who wore his authority like a well-tailored coat. He was handsome in a conventional, polished way, with a confident smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He was the law in Dustwood, but he operated more like a king in his own small fiefdom, accustomed to getting whatever and whomever he wanted. From the moment he'd first seen Clara in Walker's wagon weeks ago, he had decided she was something he wanted. He saw her not as a person, but as a prize, an untouched piece of property that the reclusive Ethan Walker had no right to possess. They had just tethered the wagon outside the general store when Morgan emerged from his office across the street. He ambled over, his spurs jingling with a practiced nonchalance, his hand resting on the colt at his hip. "Walker," he greeted Ethan with a nod, but his eyes were fixed on Clara. "And Miss Monroe, a pleasure to see you in town again." He tipped his hat to her, his smile widening. "The winter seclusion seems to agree with you. You're looking lovelier than ever." Clara murmured a polite, "Uncomfortable, thank you," instinctively taking a small step closer to Ethan. The sheriff's gaze felt like a physical touch, invasive and proprietary. Ethan's posture stiffened. "Morgan," he acknowledged, his voice flat. "We're just here for supplies." Of course," the sheriff said smoothly, his eyes still on Clara. "Dustwood is always happy to serve its residents. You must find it awfully lonely out at that ranch. Miss Monroe, if you ever need a more civilized conversation, my door is always open." It was a blatant challenge, a line drawn in the mud of the main street. Ethan's hand clenched into a fist at his side, but his face remained a stony mask. "She's not lonely," he said, his voice low and cold as a river stone. "Let's go. Clara." He placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture that was both protective and possessive, and guided her into the store. But Clara could feel Sheriff Morgan's eyes on her back the entire time, a cold promise of future trouble. Inside the store, the second front of her battle awaited. Abigail Hayes was there, holding court with a small circle of the town's most influential wives. Upon seeing Clara, Abigail's conversation stopped, and she turned, a look of pure, venomous disdain on her face. "Well, look what the blizzard blew in," she said, her voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. "I suppose even a man like Ethan Walker has his needs." The other women tittered. The storekeeper's wife suddenly found the floor fascinating. The heat of humiliation rose in Clara's cheeks, so intense she felt dizzy. It was one thing to be whispered about, another to be publicly maligned, her character dissected and destroyed for sport. She wanted to turn and run, to hide herself away in the cabin and never come out again. But then something inside her shifted. It was a spark of the same resilience that had carried her from the orphanage, the same defiance that had kept her walking after the robbery. She would not let these cruel, bitter women break her. Lifting her chin, she looked directly at Abigail Hayes and gave her a small, polite nod, as if she had just received a compliment. Then, she turned her back on them and walked calmly to the counter with her list. It was a small act of rebellion, but it was hers. Ethan, having witnessed the entire exchange, finished his business in record time. His silence on the ride home was different this time. It wasn't awkward. It was thunderous. He was furious. Not at her, but at the town, at Morgan, at the injustice of it all. He had thought to offer her a safe harbor, but he was beginning to realize he had instead marooned her on an island, surrounded by sharks. And he was the one who had drawn them. The harassment didn't stop with whispers. A few days later, Ethan had to ride out to the far pastures, a full day's trip. He left Clara with a loaded shotgun and strict instructions not to open the door to anyone. The isolation, once a comfort, now felt menacing. The wind whistling through the eaves sounded like whispers. Every creak of the cabin made her jump. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to cast long shadows, she heard riders approaching. Her heart leaped into her throat. Peeking through the window, she saw it wasn't Ethan. It was 3 cowhands from a neighboring ranch, their faces flushed with whiskey from the saloon. They were the same men who had been laughing at Abigail Hayes's remarks in the store. "Hey in there," one of them shouted, his voice slurred. "We know you're in there. Walker's little pet, come on out and be friendly." They dismounted, swaggering toward the cabin. Clara's hands trembled as she gripped the heavy shotgun. She was a lamb facing a pack of wolves. "Go away," she yelled, her voice shaking but loud. "Mister, Walker will be back any minute." This was met with raucous laughter.
We ain't afraid of Walker. Just want to see what he's keeping all to himself out here.
One of them reached the porch and jiggled the door handle. It was locked. He began to pound on the door, the force of his blows shaking the entire frame. Clara backed away, aiming the shotgun at the door, her mind a blank slate of pure terror. She prayed Ethan would come, that God would intervene. And then, a voice cut through the air, sharp and cold as a razor's edge.
Get away from my house.
The pounding stopped. The three men turned slowly. Ethan was there, atop his black stallion. Aries. He hadn't come from the direction of the far pastures, but from the woods. Having circled back with a premonition he couldn't explain, he wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a threat. His eyes, dark with a controlled rage, pinned each man in place.
We were just being neighborly. Walker, the ringleader stammered, his drunken courage evaporating in the face of Ethan's silent fury.
My neighbors don't terrorize women, Ethan said, his voice dangerously quiet. He swung down from Aries. Get on your horses. If I ever see you on my land again, I will not be this forgiving. They scrambled for their horses, mounting with clumsy haste, and galloped away as if the devil himself were on their heels. Ethan strode to the door and unlocked it. Clara was standing in the middle of the room, the shotgun still clutched in her white-knuckled hands, tears streaming down her face. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides and gently took the gun from her, setting it aside. Then, he did something he had not done since the night of the kiss. He touched her. He placed his hands on her upper arms, his grip firm and steadying.
Did they hurt you?
He asked, his voice rough with concern. She just shook her head, unable to speak, and collapsed against his chest, sobbing out all the fear and humiliation she had been holding inside. He hesitated for only a second before his arms came around her, holding her tightly. He stood there, a solid and unmovable shield, letting her cry until the storm within her had passed. That night, the wall between them was gone, but the chasm remained. They were united by the events of the day, but Ethan was more distant than ever, lost in his own tormented thoughts. He saw with painful clarity that his attempt to protect Clara was failing. His presence was the very thing that made her a target. After their silent supper, Clara couldn't bear the tension any longer. She put on her coat and slipped outside. The night was breathtakingly clear and cold. The snow on the ground glittered as if filled with diamonds, and the sky was a vast sweep of black velvet, punched through with 1,000,000 brilliant stars. The Milky Way was a shimmering, celestial river overhead. She heard the cabin door open and close behind her. Ethan had followed her out. He stood a few feet away, his silhouette dark against the lighted doorway. You shouldn't be out here alone, he said quietly. And you shouldn't have to spend your life protecting me from a world you invited me into, she replied, her voice soft but filled with a new, raw honesty. He had no answer to that. He walked over to stand beside her, and together they looked up at the immensity of the night sky. Back at the orphanage, Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. The sisters told us that God is always watching, that he sees everything we do, and we should live our lives in a way that is pleasing to him. She turned to look at him, her eyes luminous in the starlight. But they were wrong. God isn't in their church. He's out here, in all of this. She gestured to the star-dusted sky. The people in town, they whisper and they judge. They try to make me feel small and dirty. They want to decide what I am. Her gaze was unwavering, filled with a courage that stunned him. But they don't matter. Their whispers can't reach us out here. This, she said, her voice dropping, becoming intimate and brave, is the only church that matters. The sky is our only witness. Ethan felt the words like a physical blow. He saw the truth in her eyes, the simple, profound desire to be seen for who she was, not for the label society had given her. She was offering him a world with no judgment, a sanctuary for two under the silent, watchful gaze of the heavens. It was an invitation to a place where their feelings for each other were not a scandal, but something pure and elemental, as real as the ground beneath their feet and the stars above. All the desire he had been fighting, all the tenderness he had suppressed, surged through him. He wanted nothing more than to take her in his arms, to accept the world she was offering, a world where he could finally let himself feel again. He saw a future in her eyes, a dawn after a long, dark night. But he also saw her innocence, her youth, the long life she had ahead of her. To take what she was offering would be to bind her to him, to the scandal, to a life as an outcast. It would confirm every vicious rumor and slam every door that might ever open for her. He would be branding her as surely as he branded his cattle. His heart ached with the conflict. He reached out and cupped her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her soft skin. His touch was filled with a world of regret and longing. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. "You are the best, most decent person I have ever known." He took a deep, shaky breath. "And that is why I cannot be the man who ruins you." He dropped his hand and took a step back, the distance between them feeling like a mile. He was protecting her honor, the very thing she was willing to sacrifice for him. It was the cruelest kind of love, the kind that denies itself for the sake of the beloved. And in the cold, starlit silence of the frontier, it broke both of their hearts. Part 4. The Social Storm. His rejection under the stars, meant as a shield, felt to Clara like a sword. It severed the last, delicate thread of hope that had been weaving itself between them. In the days that followed, the cabin grew smaller, the silence within its walls stretching into a vast, empty expanse. They were two ghosts haunting the same space, their movements carefully choreographed to avoid contact, their words reduced to bare necessities. "The stew is on the stove. I'll be back late. Good night." Clara performed her duties with a hollow, mechanical precision. She scrubbed floors that were already clean, kneaded bread with a fury that left her arms aching, and stared out at the unforgiving landscape, feeling a kinship with its stark and lonely beauty. His act of protection had left her feeling more exposed than ever. He had looked at her with longing and then turned away, confirming in her mind what the town already believed: she was not worthy of a good man's name. She was a temptation to be resisted, a problem to be managed, a shame to be kept behind closed doors. Ethan was trapped in his own private hell. Every time he looked at her, he saw the light in her eyes dimming, the quiet resilience that had so captivated him being ground down into weary resignation. He had thought to save her from ruin, but he was instead presiding over the slow erosion of her spirit. The sight of her moving through his house, a sad and silent wraith, was a constant, searing accusation. He was a coward. He had faced down armed men, blizzards, and the brutalities of the frontier without flinching. But he had flinched from the prospect of a tarnished reputation, the ranch he had bled for, the legacy he had built from dust and sweat, suddenly felt like a gilded cage, and he was rattling its bars. The storm that had been brewing in Dustwood finally broke. The tales of the drunken cowhands, embellished with every telling in the saloon, had merged with Abigail Hayes's poisonous whispers. The story was no longer just about a rich cowboy and his housekeeper. It had become a tale of brazen sin, a moral affront to the decent, God-fearing folk of the town. And in a town like Dustwood, moral affronts required a response. It came on a Sunday, an hour after the morning service had let out. Clara was outside, scattering feed for the chickens, when she saw the riders approaching. It wasn't a random group. They rode with a grim, unified purpose. At the head was Reverend Miller, a tall, gaunt man whose piety was as severe as his black frock coat. Beside him rode Abigail Hayes, her face a mask of righteous vindication, and a handful of other town elders, their faces set with grim determination. Ethan came out onto the porch, drawn by the sound of the approaching horses. He stood there, his feet planted wide, his hands empty, but his presence as formidable as a fortress wall. "Reverend," Ethan said, his voice dangerously level. "This is a surprise. I don't recall inviting the whole congregation for lunch." Reverend Miller dismounted, his Bible clutched in his hand like a weapon. "We are not here for social pleasantries. Mr. Walker, we are here on behalf of the community, as servants of the Lord." His eyes slid past Ethan to fix on Clara, who stood frozen by the chicken coop. His gaze was filled with a chilling mixture of pity and condemnation. "We are here about the woman. Her name is Miss Monroe," Ethan bit out, taking a menacing step forward, "and she is under my protection." "It is from your protection that we have come to save her soul," the Reverend declared, his voice rising with sermonic fervor. "The town is rife with talk. Sir, you have taken this young, impressionable orphan into your home, and your arrangement has become a flagrant spectacle of impropriety. It is an offense against decency, a stain on the moral character of Dustwood." Abigail Hayes chimed in, her voice sharp and cruel. "He's right, Ethan. People are saying the Walker Ranch is no better than a brothel. It's a disgrace to your family's name, a disgrace to the memory of your dear departed Sarah." The mention of his late wife's name was a deliberate, vicious blow. Clara saw Ethan flinch as if he'd been struck. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a rigid, gray mask of fury. "You will get off my land," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "Now!" "We will not be intimidated," the Reverend stated, puffing out his chest. "We are here to make a formal request of Miss Monroe, for the good of the community, and for the sake of her own immortal soul. We ask that she leave this den of temptation and place herself in the care of the church until a more suitable position can be found for her." They were asking her to leave, to cast herself on the mercy of the very people who had scorned and condemned her. To admit her guilt, Clara felt the ground sway beneath her feet. She looked at Ethan, pleading with her eyes for him to deny it all, to tell them they were wrong, to claim her. But he was silent. He stood locked in a battle with the Reverend, his jaw clenched, his eyes blazing. But Clara saw something else in his face, something that broke her heart. She saw the flicker of his own deep-seated fear. He was a man who valued his name, his reputation. The ranch was his kingdom, built on a foundation of respect and hard work. And these people, with their Bibles and their self-righteousness, were threatening to bring it all crashing down. He was fighting for her. Yes, but he was also calculating the cost. And for the first time, she truly believed she was a price he was unwilling to pay. The confrontation ended in a stalemate. Ethan refused to yield, and the delegation, having delivered their ultimatum, finally retreated, leaving a toxic silence in their wake. That night, the cabin was a tomb. Ethan didn't speak of what had happened. He didn't try to comfort her or reassure her. He retreated into the darkest corners of his own mind, wrestling with the demons the town had unleashed. He was terrified of losing the ranch's standing, of business partners refusing to deal with him, of becoming a pariah. Was it right to sacrifice the work of a decade for one woman? But was it right to sacrifice her for the sake of the ranch? He was caught in a trap, and his instinct was to withdraw, to think, to weigh his options. Clara, watching his tormented silence, could only interpret it in one way. He was ashamed of her. He was regretting his decision to bring her here. She was the stain on his reputation. The memory of Abigail Hayes's words echoed in her mind, a disgrace to the memory of his dear departed Sarah. The thought was unbearable. She had come to care for Ethan Walker more than she had ever cared for anyone. The idea that she was not only ruining his future, but also dishonoring his past was a weight she could not bear. Despair, cold and absolute, settled over her. She would not be his ruin. She would not be the kept woman they all thought her to be. If his honor prevented him from choosing her, then her own honor would force her to leave. She made her decision in the dead of night, while the man she loved slept fitfully in the other room. There was no other way. She would choose a life of hardship, of uncertainty, of poverty, over a life of being a rich man's secret shame. With quiet, methodical movements, she packed her few belongings back into the satchel she had arrived with. Her spare dress, the Bible, the small wooden cross from her mother. She had nothing else. She moved to the table and, by the faint moonlight filtering through the window, she wrote a note on a scrap of paper. Her hand trembled, and a single tear fell, splashing onto the ink. Mr. Walker, thank you for your kindness. I can no longer be a burden to you. Please do not look for me. Yours respectfully, Clara Monroe. She left the note on the center of the table where he would be sure to see it, taking one last, lingering look around the cabin that had been her only real home. She slipped out into the cold, pre-dawn darkness. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to go. She would walk to the next town, or the one after that, and find work, any work. She would scrub floors and wash dishes for the rest of her life if she had to. It would be a hard life, but it would be an honest one. It would be hers. Ethan awoke to a silence that was different. It wasn't the quiet of another person sleeping nearby. It was the profound, hollow emptiness of a house that has been deserted. A knot of pure dread tightened in his gut. He threw on his clothes and strode into the main room. It was empty. The fire was cold. Her door was open. The bed inside neatly made, but achingly vacant. Then he saw the note on the table. He read the few, formal lines, and the paper trembled in his hand. A burden. She thought she was a burden. He sank into a chair, the full weight of his folly crashing down upon him. He had done this. His pride, his fear, his damnable, stupid silence had driven her away. He had pushed away the one good, pure thing that had entered his life in 5 years. The days that followed were a blur of torment. The cabin was no longer a home. It was a mausoleum, filled with the ghost of her presence. He saw her everywhere in the neatly folded laundry, the faint scent of cinnamon that still clung to the air in the kitchen, the empty chair across the chessboard. He stopped eating. He couldn't sleep. He would pace the floor all night, the silence screaming at him, accusing him. He was haunted by loss. He remembered standing by his wife's bedside, holding her hand as the fever stole her from him, the utter helplessness of watching someone you love slip away. He remembered the terrifying silence in the house after the doctor had left, after he had buried both his wife and his infant son under the cottonwood tree. He had survived that loss by shutting himself down, by building walls around his heart so thick he thought nothing could ever penetrate them again. He had poured all his energy, all his grief, into the ranch, making it a monument to his endurance. But Clara had slipped through the cracks in his walls. She had brought light and warmth back into his life, and he had been too afraid of the pain of losing it again to hold on to it. In trying to protect her, he had inflicted the deepest wound of all. He had let her believe she was worthless. In the depths of a sleepless, whiskey-fueled night, the realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The ranch, his reputation, the whispers of small-minded people, none of it mattered. What was a kingdom without a queen? What was a legacy if there was no one to share it with? An empty, prosperous life was no life at all. It was just a slower way to die. He had lost his first family to fate. He would not lose Clara to his own cowardice. He remembered her words under the stars. The sky is our only witness. He had turned away from that truth. He had let the judgment of Dustwood matter more than the judgment of his own heart. If he let her go, if he let her walk out of his life and disappear into the wilderness, he would lose more than just a woman he was beginning to love. He would lose the last, flickering ember of his own soul. This time, he would not stand by and watch. This time, he would fight. Part 5. The Climax of Blood and Honor. Clara walked into a world bleached of color by the pale, pre-dawn light. The cold was a physical presence, seeping through her thin coat and chilling her to the bone, but she barely felt it. Her mind was numb, her heart a cold, heavy ache in her chest. She put one foot in front of the other, her gaze fixed on the rutted track leading away from Dustwood, away from Ethan. Each step was a tiny act of self-immolation, burning the bridge back to the only home she had ever known. She had been walking for nearly 2 hours when the sun finally crested the distant mountains, casting long, distorted shadows across the plains. The sound of hoofbeats approaching from behind made her turn, a wild, foolish flicker of hope igniting in her chest. Ethan. But it was not Ethan. It was Sheriff Morgan, flanked by 2 of his thuggish deputies. He reined his horse to a halt in front of her, his polished smile a predatory slash in the morning light. "Well now, Miss Monroe," he said, his voice a smooth, oily purr. "Leaving so soon and on foot, no less, that's no way for a lady to travel." Clara clutched her satchel, her brief hope curdling into pure dread. "I am fine. Sheriff, I'm just on my way." On your way, where he pressed, dismounting and walking toward her. He moved with a cat-like grace she found deeply unsettling. "You have no people, no money. Walker finally tired of you and threw you out. Is that it? A shame, but one man's trash is another man's treasure." "Mr. Walker did not throw me out," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I chose to leave. Now, if you'll excuse me." She tried to step around him, but he blocked her path. "I don't think so. A young woman. All alone out here. It's my duty as the law to ensure your safety." He reached out and stroked a loose strand of her hair, his touch making her skin crawl. "I'll be your protector now." "I don't need your protection," she spat, pulling away from him. Morgan's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard glare. "I wasn't asking." He nodded to his deputies. "Put her on my horse. She's coming with us." Clara cried out as they grabbed her, their rough hands bruising her arms. She struggled, kicking and twisting with all her might, but it was useless. They were too strong. They threw her sideways across Morgan's saddle like a sack of grain and tied her hands with a piece of rough rope. "You see, Clara?" Morgan said, leaning close to her ear as he mounted behind her, his voice a triumphant whisper. "This is how the world works. Men like me, we take what we want, and men like Walker, they lose it." He spurred his horse, and they rode off, not back toward town, but deeper into the desolate, lawless wilderness. Ethan's discovery of the note was like a knife to the gut. The world tilted on its axis. He rode Aries into Dustwood at a full gallop, a reckless, desperate man on the edge of unraveling. He didn't care about his reputation anymore. He only cared about the gaping hole Clara's absence had torn in his world. He stormed into the Reverend's office at the church, his face a thunderous mask. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. The Reverend, startled, stammered, I don't know what you mean. Mr. Walker, the Lord's work." "To hell with the Lord's work," Ethan roared, slamming his hand down on the man's desk so hard the inkwell jumped. "You and your pack of gossiping hens drove her away. Where did she go?" His fury was so absolute that it terrified the pious man. "I swear, I do not know. She has not come to us." Ethan knew he was telling the truth. He turned and left, his mind racing. She wouldn't have gone to the church. She had too much pride. She would have taken to the road. As he emerged back into the main street, his oldest and most loyal ranch hand, a grizzled man named Gus, rode up, his face grim. "Boss," Gus said, his voice urgent. "I was checking the east fence line. Saw something that didn't sit right. Sheriff Morgan and 2 of his boys riding hard. They had a woman with them. From a distance. She looked a lot like your Miss Clara." Ethan's blood ran cold. Morgan. It all clicked into place. The sheriff's leering interest, his open challenge. He had been waiting for this chance, like a vulture circling a weakened animal. Which way were they headed? Ethan's voice was ice. "East, towards the old canyons. looked like they were in a hurry to get nowhere good. A deadly calm settled over Ethan. His purpose was now crystal clear, stripped of all doubt and fear. He looked at Gus, a man who had ridden with him for 10 years, who had been there when he'd buried his wife and child. "He's taken her. Gus!" Gus spat on the ground, his expression hardening. "Then we'll get her back." They were joined by Charlie, a younger hand who idolized Ethan and despised the sheriff's swagger. It was a small posse, just 3 men against the law, but they were bound by a loyalty deeper than any tin star. They armed themselves with rifles from the general store, the proprietor wisely asking no questions, and rode out of Dustwood, their faces set toward the desolate east. They tracked them for hours, the setting sun painting the sky in bloody strokes of crimson and orange. Darkness fell, but a full moon rose, casting the stark desert landscape in an eerie silver light. Gus, an expert tracker, finally led them to a narrow box canyon, where a single, flickering light emanated from a dilapidated miner's shack. "They're in there," Gus whispered, reining in his horse. Ethan dismounted, his Winchester rifle feeling like a natural extension of his arm. He could hear the faint sound of Morgan's laughter drifting from the shack, a sound that fueled the cold fire of his rage. "Charlie, you circle around the back," Ethan commanded in a low voice. "Gus, you're with me. We go in hard and fast. I want Clara out of there. The rest of them are yours." They moved like shadows across the rocky ground, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the gravel. As they neared the shack, they could hear Morgan's voice clearly through the thin wooden walls. You'll learn to like it, sweetheart. You'll be the sheriff's woman. A much better title than Walker's whore. Don't you think?" That was it. Ethan's control snapped. He kicked the door off its hinges, the wood splintering with a deafening crash. The scene inside was frozen for a heartbeat. Clara was tied to a chair in the corner, her face pale and tear-streaked. Morgan and his 2 deputies were at a table, a bottle of whiskey between them, their guns holstered. Surprise turned to fury on their faces. Then all hell broke loose. The shack erupted in a deafening roar of gunfire and a storm of splintered wood and smoke. One of the deputies went for his gun, but Gus was faster. A single shot from his rifle sending the man sprawling backward. Morgan kicked the table over, using it for cover as he drew his Colt, firing wildly. Ethan ignored him. His only focus was Clara. He charged across the room, shielding her with his own body as bullets whizzed past his head. As he reached her and began to slash at her ropes with his knife, a searing, white-hot pain exploded in his left side. He grunted, stumbling, but refused to go down. The rope fell away. "Get down!" he yelled at her, shoving her toward the floor as he turned back to the fight. The second deputy, firing from the corner, was taken out by Charlie's rifle through the back window. Now it was just Morgan. The sheriff rose from behind the table, his face a snarl of rage, his gun leveled at Ethan. "She's mine! Walker!" he screamed. Ethan brought his Winchester up, but the pain in his side made him slow. Morgan fired. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Ethan's shoulder, spinning him around. But even as he fell, his own fingers squeezed the trigger. His shot was true. It caught Morgan in the leg, shattering his kneecap. The sheriff shrieked in agony and collapsed, his gun clattering to the floor. Silence descended, broken only by Morgan's pathetic whimpering and the ringing in Ethan's ears. He sank to one knee, clutching his bleeding side, his vision starting to swim. "Ethan!" Clara was beside him in an instant, her small hands frantically pressing against the wound in his side, her face a mask of terror and love. "Oh God, you're hurt! You're bleeding!" "It's nothing," he gasped, though the world was starting to go dark around the edges. Are you all right?" Tears streamed down her face as she looked at him, at this man who had walked through fire for her. "Yes," she sobbed. "You saved me." He reached up, his hand shaking, and cupped her cheek, his thumb wiping away a tear. "I almost lost you," he whispered, his voice thick with a pain that had nothing to do with his wounds. "I was a fool, Clara, a damned fool." Gus and Charlie rushed in, securing Morgan and checking the bodies of the deputies. But Ethan and Clara were in their own world. With Gus's help, they got Ethan onto his horse, Clara mounting behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her cheek pressed against his back, feeling the warmth of his blood soak into her dress. The ride back to the ranch was a long, agonizing blur, every jolt of the horse sending a fresh wave of pain through Ethan. But he didn't care. She was safe. She was with him. Nothing else mattered. They reached the cabin just before dawn. Gus and Charlie helped him inside, lowering him onto his bed before riding back to town to fetch the doctor, leaving Morgan tied up and under guard. And then they were alone. The cabin was silent, save for Ethan's ragged breaths and Clara's quiet sobs. The lamplight cast a soft, golden glow over the room. All the walls they had built between them had been demolished by the night's violence and terror. All that was left was a raw, undeniable truth. Clara, her hands steady now with purpose, gently cut away his blood-soaked shirt. The sight of the two wounds, the deep gash in his side and the ugly tear in his shoulder, made her gasp. She cleaned them as best she could with hot water and clean rags, her touch infinitely tender. He was so still, so vulnerable, his usual formidable strength stripped away by his injuries. As she worked, her tears fell onto his bare skin. He was alive. He had come for her. He had chosen her. The realization was overwhelming, a tidal wave of emotion that washed away every last vestige of her fear and doubt. When she finished dressing the wounds, she sat on the edge of the bed, her hand resting on his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. He opened his eyes, his gaze finding hers in the dim light. "Don't cry," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I thought I'd lost you," she choked out, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You'll never lose me," he said, his voice filled with a fierce, unwavering conviction. He lifted a hand, his fingers tangling in her hair. "I love you, Clara. I love you." The words she had never dared to dream she would hear broke her open. A fresh wave of sobs shook her small frame. She leaned down, burying her face in the curve of his uninjured shoulder, breathing in the scent of him. "I love you too, Ethan," she whispered against his skin. "I love you so much." He gently guided her face up to his and kissed her. It was nothing like their first, tentative kiss. This was a kiss of desperation and relief, of promises made and a future claimed. It was the kiss of a man who had stared into the abyss of a life without her and had chosen to fight his way back. When they broke apart, the air was thick with a new, profound intimacy. The world outside the town, the whispers, the judgment had ceased to exist. There was only this room, this moment, and the overwhelming need to erase the horror of the night, to affirm life in the face of death. She lay down beside him on the bed, her movements fluid and natural. Her innocence was not a thing to be taken or a prize to be won. It was a gift, and she was giving it freely, joyfully, to the man who held her heart, her soul, her very life in his hands. It was the most honest and elemental choice she had ever made. And as the first light of a new day began to filter through the cabin window, in the quiet sanctuary of the home he had built and the bed he had almost died in, the Virgin lay in his cabin, and they made love under the watchful, silent gaze of the morning sky. Part 6, Aftermath and the Shadow. The morning brought with it the harsh, unforgiving light of consequence. Dr. Adams, a portly man with weary eyes and whiskey on his breath, arrived with Gus just after sunrise. He examined Ethan's wounds with a series of professional grunts, his expression grim. "He's a lucky man," the doctor announced, stitching the gash in Ethan's side with a practiced hand. "An inch to the left, and we'd be measuring him for a coffin. The shoulder wound is clean, but this one," he gestured to Ethan's side, "this one will fester if you're not careful." Keep it clean. Keep him in this bed, broth, water, and prayer. That's all I can offer." He looked at Clara, his gaze sharp and assessing. He had seen her in town, had heard the whispers. Now he saw her here, her dress stained with Ethan's blood, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering resolve. He saw a nurse, not a scandal. "The prayer might be the most important part, child," he said, his voice softening slightly. "He'll have a fever before nightfall. It will be the telling of it. If he survives the next 3 days, he'll likely survive it all." He packed his bag, gave Clara a small bottle of laudanum for the pain, and left without another word. A man accustomed to the brutal calculus of frontier life and death. And so began the long vigil. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin, to the space around Ethan's bed. Clara became a creature of pure function, her every action dedicated to the singular goal of keeping him alive. The shy, uncertain girl who had arrived in a snowstorm was gone, burned away in the crucible of the past 24 hours. In her place was a woman of formidable, quiet strength. She bathed his feverish skin with cool water, her touch gentle and soothing. She spoon-fed him broth, coaxing him to take a few sips when he was lucid. She changed his bandages with hands that did not tremble, cleaning the angry, weeping wounds with a grim determination. The sight of his blood, the intimate reality of his mortality, did not frighten her. It bound her to him. For Ethan, the days and nights blurred into a painful, feverish haze. He drifted in and out of consciousness, caught in a disorienting limbo. But through the delirium, 2 things were constant: the throbbing pain in his side and the presence of Clara. She was a cool hand on his brow, a soft voice in the darkness, a steady, anchoring force in the swirling chaos of his mind. He would wake from fever dreams of battle and loss to find her there, her silhouette framed by the lamplight, and a profound peace would settle over him. In his most vulnerable state, he was not alone. He was loved. During his brief moments of clarity, he would simply watch her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the weary slump of her shoulders as she dozed in the chair beside his bed. He saw the unwavering focus in her eyes as she tended to his wounds, and his heart ached with a love so fierce it was a physical pain, sharper than any bullet wound. He had taken her innocence, and in return, she was giving him his life. It did not feel like a fair trade. The fever broke on the 4th night. Clara, half asleep in her chair, was startled awake when she felt a hand, cool for the first time in days, touch her own. She looked up to see Ethan watching her, his eyes clear and lucid. "You're still here," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Tears of pure, unadulterated relief streamed down her face. "I told you I would be," she said, her voice thick. "I'm not leaving you." The weeks that followed were a slow, quiet journey back to the light. As Ethan's strength gradually returned, a new, domestic intimacy settled over the cabin. The charged silence of the past was replaced by the easy quiet of 2 people who no longer needed words. She would read to him from the books on his shelves: Shakespeare, Dickens, books of poetry, her soft voice a soothing balm. He would tell her stories of his time in the cavalry, of the vast, beautiful places he had seen, opening up the closed-off rooms of his past to her one by one. They existed in a fragile, perfect bubble, a world of their own making. Their love, born in terror and consecrated in passion, now deepened in the quiet soil of shared vulnerability and mutual care. He was no longer just the formidable rancher, and she was no longer just the innocent orphan. They were simply Ethan and Clara, 2 broken people who had, against all odds, found a way to make each other whole. But the world outside the bubble had not forgotten them, and it was a world that did not forgive. Gus was their only link to Dustwood, riding out once a week with supplies and news. He would deliver his report to Clara on the porch, his gaze carefully averted. a deep discomfort etched on his weathered face. He brought tales of Sheriff Morgan, who was alive but would walk with a limp for the rest of his days. Morgan was not being hailed as a villain, but as a martyr. He was telling a twisted version of the story in which he, the town's brave lawman, had been attempting to rescue a fallen woman from the clutches of a possessive and violent rival. The two deputies Ethan had killed were being lauded as heroes who died in the line of duty. The town, led by the venomous whispers of Abigail Hayes and the sanctimonious sermons of Reverend Miller, had chosen its narrative, and in that narrative, Clara was the villain, the scarlet woman at the center of the bloodshed. On his fourth visit, Gus brought the worst news of all. It's what they're saying now. Miss Clara, he stammered, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. They ain't just whispering about you being his housekeeper no more. They're saying, well, they're saying you're his woman, in every sense of the word. They're calling you names I won't repeat in your presence. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She slept with him, the final, damning verdict. The secret, sacred act of love that had healed them both was now a piece of sordid public gossip, a weapon used to destroy them. The bubble burst, and the cold, harsh reality of their situation rushed in. She thanked Gus, her voice a hollow echo of itself, and took the supplies inside. She moved through the cabin in a daze, putting things away, her mind reeling. She looked at Ethan, who was sitting up in the armchair by the fire for the first time, still pale and weak, but on the mend. He had risked everything for her. He had killed 2 men. He had nearly died. And his reward? His name was being dragged through the mud. The Walker Ranch, once a symbol of honor and hard work, was now synonymous with sin and scandal. And she was the cause of it all. The weight of it was crushing. The love she felt for him was now inextricably tangled with a deep, corrosive guilt. Every tender moment they had shared, every gentle touch, every shared smile, was now tainted by the ugliness of the town's judgment. That night, after Ethan was asleep, she sat by the fire, the ghosts of her past and the fears for her future swirling around her. She had tried to run once to save his reputation. Now, the stakes were infinitely higher. His very life, his legacy, was on the line. She was a millstone around his neck, and if she didn't cut herself loose, she would drag him down into the depths with her. Her love for him demanded the ultimate sacrifice she had to leave him. She waited 2 more days, until he was strong enough to sit at the table for a meal. She served him the beef stew she had made, her hands trembling slightly. She watched him eat, memorizing the lines of his face, the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he looked at her. When he was finished, she took a deep breath and spoke, her voice quiet but resolute. "Ethan, I have to leave." He looked up, his fork clattering against his plate. The brief, fragile peace in his eyes was shattered, replaced by a raw, immediate panic. "What are you talking about?" "I know what they are saying in town," she continued, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I know what they are calling me, what they are calling you. I have ruined you. Ethan, I have dishonored the memory of your wife and brought scandal to your name. You nearly died for me, and all I have brought you is disgrace." Tears welled in her eyes, but she would not let them fall. "I love you more than my own life, and that is why I cannot stay. I will not be the woman who destroys you." He pushed himself to his feet, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing wounds. He crossed the space between them and gripped her shoulders, his hold surprisingly strong. "No," he said, his voice a low, ragged plea. "You will not do this. You will not leave me again." "I have to," she cried, her composure finally breaking. "Don't you see? As long as I am here, you will be an outcast. They will never forgive you." "Let them," he countered, his voice rising with a desperate intensity. "Let them talk. Let them condemn us. Do you think I care about the opinions of hypocrites and fools? I have been an outcast before. Clara, I was an outcast in my own heart for 5 years. You saved me from that. Your love saved me." He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was warm and shaky.
Listen to me. My honor is not in this ranch. It's not in my name. It's here.
He took her hand and pressed it against his heart. It's with you. A life without you. That is the only dishonor I cannot bear. If you walk out that door, you will be taking everything that matters with you. The bullet in my side was nothing. Losing you again, that would kill me. It was the confession of a man laid bare, stripped of all pride and pretense. The proud, solitary Ethan Walker was begging her to stay, admitting that she was the very center of his world. He was choosing her, publicly, privately, absolutely. She looked into his eyes and saw her own love reflected there. Fierce and defiant, he was right. To run now would be to let the hatred of the town win. It would be a betrayal of the bond that had been forged between them in the blood and fire of the canyon. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his chest. "I'll stay," she whispered, her voice muffled by his shirt. "I'll stay." He held her tightly, a shudder of relief running through his body. They stood there for a long time, locked in an embrace that was both a promise and a declaration of war. Their love was deeper, stronger, and more profound than ever. But they were no longer in a bubble. They were on an island, surrounded by a hostile sea, and the tide was rising. They had chosen each other. Now, they would have to face the world together. Part 7, Chosen Forever. The truce between the Walker Ranch and Dustwood was a fragile, rotting thing, and it was only a matter of time before it snapped. Ethan was healing, his strength returning with a stubborn slowness, but the wounds inflicted upon their reputation continued to fester. The town was a powder keg of gossip, resentment, and self-righteousness, and the spark that would ignite it finally came in the form of an official notice. Nailed to the church door, a town meeting would be held to discuss the violent events that had transpired and to reaffirm the moral standards of the community. It was not a meeting. It was a trial, and they were the accused. On the day of the meeting, a cold, gray sky pressed down on the town, mirroring the oppressive atmosphere on the street. Ethan helped Clara into the wagon, his movement still stiff. He was pale, and there was a constant, faint line of pain etched around his mouth, but his eyes held the hard, unyielding glint of tempered steel. They rode into town not as supplicants seeking forgiveness, but as sovereigns of their own small kingdom, prepared for war. The church was packed, the air thick with the smells of damp wool, cheap perfume, and simmering hostility. Every pew was filled. Reverend Miller stood at the pulpit, his face a mask of grim duty. Abigail Hayes and her circle of women were in the front row, their expressions a mixture of morbid curiosity and vindictive glee. As Ethan and Clara entered, a wave of whispers followed them down the aisle. They chose to stand at the back, a silent, unified front against the sea of accusing eyes. The meeting began with a long, rambling prayer from the Reverend about sin and temptation, his gaze pointedly fixed on them. Then, he called the town's first and only witness. A path cleared, and Sheriff Morgan limped to the front, leaning heavily on a carved oak cane. He had cultivated the look of a wounded martyr, his face pale, his movements labored. He was a snake, and he knew how to play to his audience. He began his testimony in a low, sorrowful voice, recounting a fabricated tale of concern for a poor, lost girl. He painted Clara as a cunning seductress, an Eve in the Garden of Dustwood who had bewitched the grieving and vulnerable Ethan Walker. He spoke of his fatherly attempts to intervene, to save her from a life of sin. "I went to that shack as a lawman and a Christian," Morgan declared, his voice rising with theatrical passion, intending only to counsel the girl, to offer her the protection of the town. "But I was met with unprovoked, savage violence. Ethan Walker, a man blinded by his lust, ambushed us. He and his men gunned down 2 fine deputies in cold blood, all to protect his his illicit arrangement. He paused, letting the words sink in, then turned his gaze directly on Clara, his eyes filled with a reptilian malice. This woman is the root of it all. She is a blight on this community. She has brought bloodshed and shame to our doorstep. She has destroyed our peace and corrupted our good name. I ask you, the good people of Dustwood, how long will we allow this moral poison to fester in our midst? A murmur of angry agreement swept through the church. Abigail Hayes nodded vigorously. The verdict was all but delivered. Clara felt a tremor of fear run through her, but Ethan's hand found hers, his grip warm and steady, a silent anchor in the storm. When Morgan had finished his performance and limped back to his seat, Reverend Miller looked to the back of the room. "Mr. Walker," he said, his tone heavy with judgment, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Ethan released Clara's hand and took a slow, deliberate step forward. The room fell silent. Every eye was on him. He did not look at the Reverend or at Sheriff Morgan. He looked out at the faces of the townspeople, his gaze moving from one to the next, clear and unflinching. "I will not defend myself against the lies of a coward and a kidnapper," he began, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. It was not the voice of a man on trial. It was the voice of a man delivering a verdict of his own. Jedediah Morgan did not go to that shack to save anyone. He went there to claim what he believed was his property, because that is all she has ever been in his eyes. He is a man who believes his badge gives him the right to take whatever he wants. He is the poison in this town, not her. He turned then, and his gaze fell upon Clara. The hardness in his eyes melted away, replaced by a look of such profound, unwavering love that it silenced every whisper, every shifting foot. The entire church seemed to hold its breath. "You want to talk about morals," he said, his voice growing stronger, resonating with absolute conviction. "Let me tell you about Clara Monroe. She came here with nothing but a Bible and a belief in the goodness of people. She was robbed, left for dead, and when I found her, she was half frozen in a blizzard. I offered her a job. She offered me a reason to live again." He took a step toward her, closing the small distance between them. He reached out and gently took her hand, pulling her forward to stand beside him, facing the town together. "You can whisper your gossip. You can preach your sermons and pass your judgments. It does not matter. None of you matter. All that matters is this." He lifted her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "She is not my housekeeper. She is not my mistress." He looked directly at Abigail Hayes, then at Reverend Miller, and then at every single person in the room. His voice rang out, clear and final, a declaration that was also a vow. "She is my woman, and I chose her. I chose her then. I choose her now. And I will choose her for all the days I have left. I chose her forever." The words hung in the air, stunning the congregation into a momentary, shocked silence. It was not a defense. It was a claiming. It was an act of absolute defiance. Abigail Hayes was the first to recover. "Blasphemy," she shrieked, rising to her feet. "He admits it. He admits his sin and flaunts it in the house of God." The room erupted. Shouts of shame and outcast filled the air. But then, a new voice cut through the din, rough and unpolished but filled with an undeniable authority. "That's enough." It was Silas Blackwood, a dirt-poor farmer from the edge of town. He was a man of few words, known for his bad luck and his fierce pride. He stood up, his worn clothes a stark contrast to the Sunday best of the town's elite. "I ain't a church-going man," Silas said, his eyes fixed on Ethan. "But I know a good man when I see one. 5 years ago, when the blight took my crops and my children were starving. The bank was going to take my farm. This man," he pointed a calloused finger at Ethan, "rode out to my place. He didn't preach at me. He gave me seed for the next season and enough money to feed my family through the winter. He told me to pay him back when I could. He's never once asked for a penny of it." A hush fell over the room. Another figure stood, a widow named Martha Jennings. When the spring thaw took my roof, Sheriff Morgan told me it was my own problem. Ethan Walker sent 2 of his own men, on his own time, to fix it. He never said a word about it to anyone. One by one, a few others, the blacksmith, a Mexican family from the edge of town, people Ethan had helped quietly, without fanfare, over the years began to murmur their agreement. The community, once a monolithic wall of condemnation, was fracturing. The clean, simple lines of sin and righteousness were becoming blurred by the inconvenient truths of character and compassion. The chaos was finally brought to order by the heavy thud of a gavel against the pulpit. An old man, who had been sitting quietly in the front pew, rose to his feet. It was Judge Harlan Vance, the circuit judge, a man whose wisdom was as legendary as his temper. He had been in town on other business and had decided to attend the meeting. "I have heard enough," the judge said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commanded immediate respect. He turned his piercing blue eyes on Sheriff Morgan. "Sheriff, you claim you were acting in an official capacity to rescue a damsel in distress. Yet you took her, a woman you admit was unwilling, to an abandoned shack miles from town. And the only witnesses were 2 deputies of questionable character. That does not sound like a rescue. That sounds like an abduction." He then looked at Ethan. "And you, Mr. Walker, you admit to killing 2 men. They were firing on me while I was protecting Miss Monroe." Ethan stated simply, "It was a fair fight." "Indeed," the judge mused. He looked out at the divided congregation. "I have been a judge on this frontier for 40 years. I have seen more sin, hypocrisy, and violence than this church has seen prayers, and I have learned one thing. The law is here to punish crimes, not to regulate the hearts of men." He fixed Reverend Miller with a stern glare. "A community is not built on condemnation, Reverend. It is built on the hard work of raising barns and raising families. It is built on helping your neighbor when his crops fail and tending to his wounds when he is shot." Finally, he looked at Ethan and Clara, standing together, their hands still clasped. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "What happens between a man and a woman who have chosen each other is a matter for them and for their God. It is not, and never will be, the business of this town, or of my court." He banged the gavel once more. "This meeting is adjourned. Go home and tend to your own gardens." It was over. The verdict had been rendered. Ethan and Clara turned and walked toward the door. The crowd parted for them. A silent, human sea. Some faces still held contempt, but many now held a grudging respect. They had not been forgiven. They had been seen. As they stepped out of the church and into the weak, gray sunlight, Clara took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. They had faced the storm and had not broken. They had walked through the fire and had emerged on the other side, not unscathed, but together. The battle was won. They had chosen each other, not just in the privacy of the cabin, but in the heart of the world that had tried to tear them apart. And for the first time, the future felt not like a threat, but like an open frontier, waiting for them to claim it. Part 8, The New Dawn. The ride back from Dustwood was not one of triumphant celebration. It was quiet, somber, and deeply peaceful. The gray, oppressive sky that had hung over the town meeting seemed to break apart as they left the last buildings behind, allowing pale, watery shafts of sunlight to illuminate the vast prairie. They had not won a victory in the conventional sense. They had simply endured, had stood their ground and spoken their truth, and in the harsh calculus of the frontier, that was a victory of its own. They did not speak. There was no need. The silence between them was no longer a chasm of unspoken feelings or a tense battlefield of doubt. It was a shared space, a sanctuary woven from the threads of their ordeal. Clara leaned her head against Ethan's good shoulder, feeling the steady strength of him, the quiet rhythm of his breathing. She was no longer afraid of what the world thought, only profoundly grateful for the world she had found in this one man. That night, the cabin felt different. It was no longer a refuge from the world, but a home they had successfully defended. As Clara tended to the fire, Ethan came to stand behind her. He did not touch her, but she could feel the warmth of his presence, a comforting weight in the quiet room. "Judge Vance is leaving town in 2 days," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Before he goes, he has agreed to do one more piece of business." Clara turned, her heart giving a hopeful, questioning leap. "What business?" Ethan's eyes, so often guarded and filled with old sorrows, were clear and bright with a future she had never dared to imagine. "He's going to marry us. Clara, here, on our land, if that's what you want." It was not a question, but a statement of fact, of a truth that had become as solid and real as the stone of the hearth. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness or fear, but of a joy so profound it was almost painful. She didn't need a grand proposal or a diamond ring. She just needed this man, this home, this promise of forever. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, Ethan, yes, that is what I want." He finally reached for her then, pulling her into an embrace that was gentle and reverent. He held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, a treasure he had fought for and won. Their wedding day dawned bright and clear, a perfect spring morning that felt like a blessing from the sky itself. The last of the winter snow had melted, and the prairie was alive with the tender green of new grass and the scattered, vibrant colors of Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets. The air was fresh and clean, filled with the scent of damp earth and the distant promise of summer. They did not marry in the church that had condemned them. They chose a spot on a gentle rise overlooking the cabin, with the vast, open rangeland stretching out before them and the distant, snow-capped mountains standing as silent witnesses against the brilliant blue sky. Their congregation was small, a collection of souls bound not by blood or dogma, but by loyalty and kindness. Gus and Charlie were there, their hats in their hands, their weathered faces scrubbed clean and filled with a quiet pride. Silas Blackwood arrived with his wife and their 3 shy children, who clutched a small, hand-picked bouquet of wildflowers for the bride. The widow Martha Jennings came, her smile genuine and warm. And finally, Judge Harlan Vance rode up, his black coat a stark contrast to the lively colors of the prairie. He dismounted, his stern face softening as he looked at the simple, heartfelt scene before him. This, his eyes seemed to say, was a truer expression of the law than anything that happened in a stuffy courtroom. Clara had no white dress, no veil of lace. She wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton that Ethan had ordered for her from a catalog weeks ago, a silent act of hope he had kept to himself. She had woven some of the children's wildflowers into her hair, and she had never looked more beautiful. Her innocence was still there, but it was no longer the fragile innocence of a girl who knew nothing of the world. It was the radiant, resilient innocence of a woman who had seen the worst of it and had chosen love anyway. Ethan stood beside her, his healing wounds a visible testament to the price they had paid. He wore a clean shirt and his best trousers, his gaze fixed on Clara with an intensity that made her feel like the only person on earth. The judge's words were not from a prayer book. They were simple, direct, and resonant with the wisdom of a long life. He spoke of resilience, of building a home in a hard land, and of the courage it takes to choose one's own path. "In this world," he said, his gravelly voice carrying on the gentle breeze, "there are few things that are truly sacred. The land, a man's word, and the family you build with your own 2 hands." He looked from Ethan to Clara. "Do you, Ethan Walker, take this woman, Clara Monroe, to be your lawfully wedded wife, to protect, honor, and cherish, for all of your days?" Ethan never took his eyes off Clara. "I do," he said, his voice clear and strong, a vow that echoed across the plains. "And do you, Clara Monroe," the judge continued, "take this man, Ethan Walker, to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love, honor, and cherish, for all of your days?" Clara looked up at the man who had saved her, challenged her, and loved her back to life. "I do," she whispered, her heart overflowing. There were no rings to exchange. Instead, Ethan took both of her hands in his large, calloused grip enfolding hers completely. It was a more binding symbol than any circle of gold. "Then, by the authority vested in me, by the territory," Judge Vance declared, a rare, genuine smile gracing his lips. "And with the sky itself as your witness, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The small gathering broke into heartfelt applause. Gus let out a loud whoop, and Silas Blackwood's children giggled, running to hug Clara's legs. Martha Jennings wiped a tear from her eye. In that moment, on that sun-drenched hill, they were not outcasts. They were a community. They were a family. Their wedding feast was a simple, joyful affair. They spread blankets on the grass and shared the roasted chicken and fresh bread Clara had prepared. Charlie played a lively tune on a harmonica he produced from his pocket, and Silas's children danced in circles until they were dizzy. Laughter, a sound that had been absent from the ranch for too long, filled the air, warm and genuine. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a golden, syrupy light over the landscape, their guests began to depart, leaving them with warm handshakes and sincere wishes for a long and happy life. Finally, they were alone. The setting sun painted the sky in breathtaking strokes of orange, pink, and deep violet. Ethan took Clara's hand, and, together, they walked to the very crest of the hill, the place where they had spoken their vows. They stood side by side, looking out at the vast expanse of their land, their home. The first stars of evening were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. It was a world away from the star-filled night when she had made her brave, desperate declaration. Then, she had been a girl offering a forbidden dream. Now, she was a wife, standing beside her husband, her future as wide and as promising as the horizon before her. Ethan turned to her, his profile outlined against the vibrant afterglow of the sunset. He drew her close, his arm wrapping securely around her waist. He was healed, not just from the bullets, but from the older, deeper wounds that had kept him locked in a prison of grief for so long. She had been his cure. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear, his voice a low, intimate whisper that was meant only for her. "The sky will watch us make love," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion and the fulfillment of a promise. "But this time, my Clara, this time, it's as husband and wife." A slow, radiant smile spread across Clara's face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated happiness, a smile of peace. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart finally, truly at rest. She had come to this harsh, unforgiving land as a destitute orphan, armed with nothing but a fragile faith. She had faced robbery, prejudice, and mortal danger. But she had also found a strength she never knew she possessed, and a love deeper and truer than any she had ever read about in her books. This was her home. Not the cabin, not the land, but this man. This was the family she had been praying for her entire life. The West was still a wild and unpredictable place, and she knew their life would not be without its hardships. But for the first time, she was not afraid. With Ethan by her side, she could face any storm. Together, they would build their life, a testament to a love that had refused to be broken. A love that had healed the deepest of losses and forged a new beginning in the heart of the wild. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello, share your thoughts, and connect with fellow fans. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help more people discover our stories.